Our next speaker is Michelle Ash. I first heard Michelle speaking at Indaba conference in Cape Town, where I was fascinated by her idea of not mining gold, but leaving it in the ground and evaluating it as in the ground resource. I later heard excellent presentations from Michelle's team at Barrick at Mines and Money in London, and they were all very innovative and exciting. And later I learned that Michelle joined MindSpider team as an advisor, and MindSpider, of course, a startup from Berlin that is part of this conference. So I'm very grateful for Michelle for joining us today. She's joining us from Melbourne, Australia. She is currently a CEO of Geovia, which is, of course, a company that is delivering a lot of services for a mining industry, from resource modeling through to mine design, optimization, and all the way through to shipping. So I'm very happy that Michelle is also a blockchain believer, and very happy to have her here with us today. So welcome, Michelle.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tanya, for that opening, and thank you all of you for allowing me to be here and to present to you. So as Tanya says, I am a blockchain believer. I've been involved in blockchain not as long as some, but certainly for a mining industry executive quite a long time, most probably about 5 or 6 years now. And certainly when I was Chief Innovation Officer for Barrick, we started really investigating blockchain. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is really what are some of the use cases that are starting to appear in the mining industry, and what makes them interesting. And I know you've heard from a number of different groups already today, so hopefully this will actually bring some of those to sort of together. So before I do that, I just wanted to, this is a slide I often start a lot of my presentations with, which is that it is our job as, you know, whether it's an executive in mining, as a technologist, as somebody who's really interested in how technology enables and drives change in industries, it's our job as leaders to prepare our teams, prepare our industry for the accelerating rate of change in the world. And I say that especially in blockchain, because often blockchain is seen as, well, it historically has been seen as absolute cutting edge. You know, I remember 5 years ago when I first started getting involved, you know, it was the technology to understand, and it was going to, you know, solve everything. And I think you've heard from a number of people today that, you know, it definitely has uses, and it definitely, you know, we need to understand where it can add value. And I think blockchain gives the example of where, in some cases, we've got to go slow, understand the technology, understand what we want to do with the technology in order to go fast and then accelerate and to scale the technology. I'll give you some examples of where I think scaling is now, you know, really possible with the blockchain technology. The very first thing I think you need to start with is a good problem to solve. You know, I think too often, and, you know, I'm an engineer, and so I love technology, I love understanding things. Too many of us start with the technology and then try to find a problem for that technology to solve. You know, I think a better way, and certainly even the genesis of the blockchain technology was, you know, here is a problem that we want to solve. How do we solve that problem? And then what is the most efficient technologies or enablers in order to solve that problem? So broadly, I think there are 5 problems that the mining industry is trying to solve: global ore body intelligence, electrification and automating of mines, precision extraction, symbiotic development, how we deliver value to communities and governments, and then understanding different ways and different business models, so introducing disruptive business models. And I think where I see blockchain most in advantage is especially around the symbiotic development, where we want to create different ways of engaging with communities. Certainly in terms of disruptive business models, I'm thinking of fundamentally different ways of operating our business, and the example, which I'll talk more about later on, of leaving gold in the ground, I think is a good one for that. But also there's some others, especially in precision extraction, that might be also interesting. The other thing I think we always need to think about when we're looking for what are the best use cases, what are the best problems to solve, and then how do they manifest themselves in use cases, and blockchain is no different. And I think, in fact, some of the use cases for blockchain, where they haven't been successful, is that they haven't looked at all three of these spheres. So the first thing is the technology and its ability to solve that problem, is it feasible? So is it literally practical? Does it enable that problem to be solved? Does it leverage some of the core capabilities that others have spoken about in terms of that technology? The second is then, is it viable? So is there a business case around that? So again, I think in the early stages of blockchain technology being applied to mining, we try to apply it to problems where, something at the scale and sophistication of blockchain technology actually, and comes with, a reasonable price tag of how to set it up and establish it, the different nodes, etc. It just wasn't commensurate with the value that was going to be driven by solving that problem. There was a simpler solution that was still going to solve that problem, and at a more reasonable, with a more reasonable business case. So the question of viability always need to be worked on, both in terms of the problem that you're solving and the solution that you're bringing. But then I think the third component, which can be quite challenging with blockchain, and we'll go, and in fact you've heard from a number of people already why that's the case in terms of the need to get different and quite disparate groups together. But this issue around desirability, and I think certainly one of the challenges for leaving gold in the ground, for example, is the issue around other institutions and the desirability of the solution set, and how many different groups you have to get together in order to make that solution possible. So Nirvana is always where you've got a feasible enabling technology that has a great business case and people love and want to use and want to help you proliferate. That's the sort of the essence to this balanced view of innovation. And so you'll see with some of the use cases that we talk about, they may not be the biggest use cases, they may not be the ultimate solution, but they hit all three of those spheres. And I think the other thing to be also conscious of, especially when it comes to blockchain, is there will be a maturity both as an industry, as we start using and rolling out some of these solutions, as a society, as we start rolling out some of these solutions, all the way through to multi-governments. And why I say that is because one of the things that I believe challenges blockchain's desirability is that to some extent blockchain breaks down this idea of the corporation. So if we think about corporations, they were established for us to industrialise, for us to pull capital, for us to have limited liability for that capital, for us to build infrastructure, factories, steam engines, nuclear power stations, all of those sort of industrialised and industrial features. Now, I'm not sure whether that same institution will survive through in this now data age, because if you think about what we're starting to do with data, we're starting to break outside of the corporation. Blockchain, by definition, breaks outside of the control or the of the corporation in most cases. Otherwise, you're starting to look at private blockchains and then really narrow them down. So I think, some of the real high value use cases we'll start seeing in the future will be as we start stretching and rethinking the role of the corporation and sometimes even the role of governments within our society more broadly. So the couple of use cases I really wanted to focus on, and I know some of these have already come up, so I'll talk about them, maybe more generically. But I think one of the very strong use cases, and whether it be the World Economic Forum's blockchain work, which I've been party to being part of, or whether it be some of the things you've heard already from MindSpider, Everledger, different organisations within the blockchain community. But there's this fundamental question that people want answered around where do our materials come from? And how can I have transparency and traceability in a very easy and audible and cheaply auditable way? Now, what we can now layer on top of those, so people want to know, where did my cobalt come from? Where did my diamond come from? Who has contributed to its production? How does it contribute back to those communities? And I think the great thing with blockchain and what we're starting to see now is some of those attributes being assigned or associated with the that material, that diamond or that gram of gold. And not only can we then create transparency for the end user, not only in terms of where it came from, but also what went into producing it. So how much carbon, how many chemicals, how did it contribute to the society more broadly? So, what was its contribution to the community? What was its contribution to, education or whatever it might be? We can do that not only, and I think some good use cases where we've seen as it literally flows through the value chain, but we could even potentially do that if we take the geological model and its potential at inception. So we can actually start then modelling and thinking about, how will each of these grams of material, how do we plan them to be, and then how do they ultimately become as we track that through. So I think certainly this issue around where our materials come from, material tracking, and the attributes that go into production and what those materials give back to the world is a fundamentally important use case that we're starting to see more and more examples of. The second use case that I think is again fantastic, and we're seeing, whether it be Vale, we saw Rio, we're seeing a number of other organisations. But how do we create trust and reduce costs? And obviously, one of the most specific use cases is that it is in shipping. How do I know that good has got on the ship from the buyer's perspective? And from a seller's perspective, how do I know that it then gets to that buyer and then the buyer trusts enough that allows me to transact? So I think, some of the interesting use cases that we're starting to see come out now is not only, tracking it through or tracking some products through the whole shipping cycle as it sort of changes hands, giving governments traceability. So again, some sort of traceability, but also what are the players in that cycle that are there only to create trust? So for example, in the shipping market, we all engage and we purchase LCs. The only point of an LC is to have a third-party intermediary between the buyer and the seller so that the seller gets their money faster, the buyer has confidence that the product is coming, and there's not sort of this arbitrage or disappearance anywhere in between. And, the providers of LC take a margin for that. So the question then is, can we use blockchain? And in fact, there's been some examples where organisations have used blockchain in order to, rather than needing that LC, to be able to transact between two effective organisations and create that trust. and therefore, ultimately reducing cost, reducing waste, and simplifying the process. The third use case that I wanted to bring up and really just sort of elevate is this whole issue around, what can we automate from a contractual perspective that allows us not only to drive accountability but also reduce costs. And there's a number of startups currently. I know Data Gumbo, as well as others, starting to look at and in fact enacting in this space, where not only can we sort of go, well, how do we set some criteria that allows for the immediate transaction of this contract? So I know in Barrick we started looking at things like even insurance. How can you define the preconditions for insurance such that, rather than having to send out an assessor when something occurs, rather than, having to go through all sorts of records when something occurs, we load up material. We know that the maintenance contracts or maintenance activities have been done. We know that there was maybe a wind that exceeded a certain speed or volume, and that immediately then triggers the resolution of that contract. Or if it's a good that's transacting, there might be a situation where if I'm a drilling contractor, if I drill so many meters and I drill them in a particular time, I may get a value uplift for that, because that's important for my client, both a quality and a time metric. So rather than having to, again, have these laborious processes where we have to sort of go through and get people to qualify and get people to understand whether that's occurred, we can set some of those criteria. We can have that instantaneous contract settlement. Should those criteria be met, we have some sort of monitoring and measurement process. And similarly, on the other side, the buyer, maybe they're entitled to discounts based on volume. Now, rather than having to go through a number of different contracts or a number of different parts of the contract to know whether I've hit that volume requirement, again, we can build those in to smart contracts automatically, and then automatically what is due, changes hands. So I think, not only driving accountability but simplifying the process overall. And then, of course, the third one, which is really around creating new models to drive sustainability and new business models. And, again, I think the one that still is of most interest and most dear to my heart is this issue around, do we have to mine gold in order to transact it? Given that we identify it, we put it into a block model, we mine it, we lift it out of the ground, we refine it, and then we put it into the ground again. We just call that a vault, where most of our gold is stored. Can't we again create that trust environment? Because the only reason we do that is so that everybody believes that we have the gold and that the gold is then secure. It's basically a trust issue. So again, can we create with a blockchain not only the ability to, down to the last gram, identify each of the pieces of the ore body, let's say, but also be able to transact that. So I could, potentially buy a gram of that ore body. I can then, transact that with other people, as if it was gold, and not have the need to convert it from one vault, which we call an ore body, to another vault, which we happen to have in a bank. But, I think there are a number of instances where we can think differently about a business model and use blockchain in order to drive those changes. For example, one of the discussions at the moment is around even, the future of mining and whether ore bodies ultimately should be still continue to be owned by the government, whether they should be owned by private companies, how do they benefit the community? Can you actually use blockchain as a way to automatically give back some of the royalties to the community or individuals that originally were part of the the area where those ore bodies were created, could mining companies be even Uber integrators? So they can pull together the best people to extract that resource. The resource stays the property of the government or the community, but we then use blockchain technology not only to integrate but to also then distribute, and we do that in a way that is much more sophisticated because of the automation available by using that. But so there are a number of the sorts of types of use cases that I think we're starting to see in the industry that I think is starting to not only get legs as such at the proof of value stage, but now starting to look like they're being scaled, which I think is fantastic. So, I think the key to any technology is focusing on the not only the problem that you want to solve, but how it's delivering value, and then deliver that value, and then obviously scale being key to success. And that's the presentation. So hopefully you've got some questions, and if I can't answer them immediately, at least be able to get back to you with a full answer.
Much, Michelle. Really exciting. I always thought blockchain is a revolutionary technology, and I guess because of my country of origin, I light up when I hear the word revolution. But I never thought that blockchain will actually break up the corporation, and I really should have thought of that. And that's a whole new avenue for me to explore.
Yeah.
I have one question. Public versus private blockchain. What do you think?
So look, I am a revolutionary at heart, so I'm always going to have propensity for a public blockchain because I think that ultimately delivers the full value that blockchain can deliver. But I do accept that not all problems can be solved with a public blockchain, that sometimes we do need to, at least at this point, because of the constraint, frankly, of the corporation, we need to establish private blockchains and then obviously create value, and then as we scale that, we might find that we can move between the two. But look, I don't think one is obviously I favour public because I think the distribution of information, the transparency, ultimately that's what we should be striving towards. But I also accept the functionality of where we are as a society and as a race. Well, not a race, that's unfair, but as a society. Yeah, so I think that would be my gut feel.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll hope we'll stay in touch.